Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Education is an interesting space. And I've been trying to think about education differently than it has been. So let me start with a proposition of what it ought to be, which won't sound all that shocking. Education should be about producing happy, healthy, impactful lives and letting society reap the benefits. But let me step it up a notch. It should be explicitly and measurably and solely about those things. So let me talk about how I came to that conclusion, how it relates to listening machines, and why I think this is crucial, not just from an education standpoint, but quite frankly, from a civilization standpoint. So I already referenced the fact that my wife and I did some work once for the University of Phoenix on a project to design a system. What it did is it listened to college students, undergrads in a biology course, and MBA students in an economics course. So these are University of Phoenix. The one positive thing you can say about it is they've got a lot of data. This was 10,000 undergrads and 20,000 MBA students. And what we listened to was their online discussion forum data. So this was a required part of all of their courses. Faculty would post a question 2 a week, and they had to respond. 5% of their grade. We didn't look at their homework, we didn't look at their tests, we didn't talk to the faculty, we didn't use the textbook, there were no experts involved. We designed a system that simply learned biology and learned economics by listening to the students talking to each other. Now clearly, it didn't know normative biology, it didn't know right from wrong, but it knew how students thought about it. How did we demonstrate that? Our goal wasn't to build an automated grading system, but we thought, okay, we have the system. By the way, I'm skipping all the technical details. If anyone's interested in the networks and so forth, talk to me afterwards. But we built the system. We simply put a logistic regression on top of it. Given the state of the network, predict the grade this person would get. Okay, great. 20,000 new students, 10,000 in each course with new faculty and new instructors, entered the system. At week 1, we knew what grade they would get, just from them talking to one another. That's it. As the course progressed, week by week, they have short courses, 5 weeks for the biology, 6 weeks for economics. We knew with greater and greater accuracy what they would get wrong or right on the final exam. And then in the end, on a 100-point scale, we were within 2 points of everyone's final score in the course. Again, only from the discussion forum data on novel assessments with novel faculty. Now, it's a very top-down curriculum for any of you academics in the room, so that was certainly consistent across all of the classes of these courses. And there's a lot of things you can run with right from there. If we can predict the final exam, why have it? Why waste not just the exam time, but also probably the weeks of prep and in such a compacted course? What does that mean for standardized testing if you can predict all of these things? But let me pause there and make vague reference to something I talked about last night. So we published a series of papers, both at places like NIPS and places like educational journals, about this work. And then I started as chief scientist of a company called Guild. That was where we built this giant database of 122 million working professionals, and we predicted their career outcomes. So guess what wasn't predictive? Your grades, your test scores, the university you went to, your skill sets, all of the things that education is focused on was not interesting. Just didn't provide any educational value. A CS degree in computer science, a bachelor's degree in computer science from Stanford turned out to only be a very modest predictor of your ability as a software developer. You need to know how to program to be a programmer, but beyond that, it doesn't tell me anything. In fact, the things that we found that were predictive were fascinating, and I'll kind of get a little bit into what they are, but they're fascinating because they were just as predictive for a 20-year-old programmer as for a 35-year-old salesperson, as a 50-year-old CEO, as the world's best skateboarders. So Red Bull invited me to come down, and yeah, I was on the plane thinking, why the fuck am I going to Santa Monica to visit Red Bull? But it turned out these were really interesting people, and they showed the same patterns of behavior that we were picking up when we followed people's Twitter feeds and we read the bio sections on their LinkedIn. All of this stuff. And by the way, that was the most interesting things for making our predictive models, was the unstructured data that people were generating themselves. Structured stuff was interesting to have, but boy, when you looked at like the bio section rather than the skills or the work histories of people, so rich and so informative. But what's interesting, not only is it was predictive across all of those wildly different job verticals, it's the same stuff that literally decades and decades of education literature shows are predictive of the life outcomes of 4- and 5-year-olds. So my wife and I wrote a white paper about this, and we called it Metalearning, which is a bit circular because really it was just all of these constructs that have been shown to be predictive. So roughly speaking, they fall into 4 categories. General cognitive ability, so things like working memory span, long-term memory ability, attention, metacognition, so this is problem solving. Personality and mindset, so think grit and Carol Dweck's work in mindset. I just gave a TED talk about endogenous motivation. And then finally, a bit of a catch-all of things that roughly correlated together of creativity and emotion. So these were the things, when we looked at a salesperson, really told us that they would be effective. And it turned out even there we can do some listening machines work. How do we, one of these constructs in personality and motivation is endogenous motivation. So this is that drive that comes from within. And it is in opposition to exogenous motivation, which is largely sensitivity to incentive systems, praise and punishment and bonuses and so forth. Endogenously motivated people, both in my own research and in reams and reams of others, as a population vastly outperform exogenously motivated people. Well, that's interesting because the entire way that we structure our companies and our classrooms are exogenous. It's all about grades, it's all about incentive systems, bonuses, and the threat of firing. So what did we do? We simply looked at things like repository behavior, software developers pushing code to repository, or sales behavior. When are people making sales with respect to their sales cycle? Every company I've ever worked at, 95% of your sales come in the last 2 days of the sales cycle. Well, who consistently made sales the day afterwards? There's no inherently logical reason that they should be your best salespeople, but when you do little things like a Fourier analysis on that time series behavior, you see inevitably the wider your sales behavior, the wider your repo behavior, the better performance and the more productivity that person showed. Invariably, they were your most productive people. And the same thing in the classroom. So I'm going to just drop that thread and come back to education. I, about a year ago, left Guild, returned, started a company called Sokos, and we thought, let's take the work we'd done predicting grades and trying to teach content and say something really ambitious. What if we could put microphones in the classroom with migrant kindergartners, record everything they're saying and everything that gets said back to them, and then literally predict their life outcomes? How long they'll live, how far they'll go in their education, how much money they make across their life, and how happy they'll be. These aren't arbitrary constructs. This is what the literature tends to look at in longitudinal studies tracking people across their lifetimes. And it turns out, at least in an actuary sense, we can do this. So this was originally an idea I threw out on stage giving a keynote at South by Southwest, and this woman, a cultural anthropologist at UT Austin, wrote an email to me saying, we can do this, we want to do this, and we want to get started today. That's where the South Texas migrant kindergartners came into the mix. But here's an additional proposition that some of you, but not all of you, probably don't take into account, which is, how do we do this in a school that can't afford it? So if you've ever heard of it, there's a project called Providence Talks, where they have this little thing called Lena, and it's very expensive, but they put it in all of the kids in the Providence school system, recording everything, just like I said, everything that gets said back. Interesting, fascinating things. I can't do that in Liberia, so I'm not interested. What can I do with Radio Shack mics? What can I do with 3 Radio Shack mics in a classroom? Turns out that's enough for me able to regularly localize people's voices, attribute it to a specific speaker, and then make observations. It's messy, it's dirty, it's imperfect, but it's enough that we can hang our hat on it and make these predictions. Turns out, though, it's a cursed crystal ball. If I tell anyone the outcomes of these predictions, it only makes things worse. So instead, to finish up, we decided to do something very different. We'll simply send a single text message home every night to their parents. Here's the one thing you can do tonight that'll have the biggest impact on your child's life. All designed out of this literature of what interventions that actually predict and change life outcomes. Make a recording with low quality, easy to deploy equipment, and then send a simple text message home. So we've now built that into a product, and we're working to deploy it now in rural China and in Kenya and Nigeria, in Dallas and Louisville, and looking for partners to do it in other places in the world. So I'll leave it there. So much left unsaid, but there's an opportunity to be able to change the world with nothing more than simple little devices. But boy, so many questions that come along with it. So one for you is, how do you gain access? How do you deploy technologies in a world where the vast majority of people actively don't want to use them? Which is the reality of education. And not to dump on Coursera and Khan Academy, but let's do it anyways. It takes a couple of Stanford professors to think the hard part of education is just making information available. No, it's engagement. It's not only the economics of deploying extremely low-cost technology, but it is the reality that most people are simply not, the people that need it the most, although you can help everybody, simply are not going to be motivated to make use of it. So.
I am so thrilled that Vivienne could be here, because this work both excites me, and I think it is fascinating, but it also raises for me really thorny questions in at least two vectors. And I want to just throw 2 at you before we move to everybody else. The first is this idea of predicting life outcomes. And what worries me in the way that many of the predictive tools we have still, let's be honest, pretty clunky. We can do some things quite well, but the more complex the data we're using, the clunkier the prediction. And what worries me is when I see children being attached to predictions, is that we're not allowing for all of the completely complex, strange turns in their lives that could have enormous impacts on them. And if we've already attached a label, this kid is going to be this type of person, this kid is going to be that type of person, then teachers change the way they relate to them. They're like, this is the kid who's going to be bright and who's going to end up being a CEO. This is the kid who's going to end up being the janitor. Does that change? I think that does. I think there's
that's exactly the cursed crystal ball problem.
So,
it's not just our work. Lots of people have
Absolutely.
studied this. It doesn't. I'm not just talking about negative predictions. Your child's going to win a Nobel Prize. I just made it less likely to happen for a variety of reasons, largely about sort of stereotype threat and expectation. It becomes very exogenous at that point. Oh God, I got to live up to that. Now, needless to say, when I make negative predictions, when anyone makes those sorts of things, that also has its, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to expect much out of this child anymore. And it becomes incredibly frustrating. I'm not saying that the sorts of things I'm talking about ought to scare people. That's appropriate. We shouldn't just say yes or no to technologies. We should make rational decisions about this. But for example, at age 25, no one should have bet on me being alive at 30. Much less ever having done anything worthwhile with my life, ever, period. So how would a system have responded to someone like me? Well, I hope one of the things it would have responded, and one of the things we actually see emerging out of our own system, is recognizing some people like me just are not going to do well early in life. And here are things you can do with those kids as well. So I don't dismiss the problem at all. The only thing I'll say about it is with our predictions, which are nowadays entirely implicit. So we have one set of machine learning tools that make the predictions and another set that consumes it to make the intervention recommendations. And no human is involved in that loop. But of course, I don't want the predictions to come true. Like, that's explicitly our goal, is to change the future. So even if we're correct, hopefully the other side is correct too, and it deploys the right intervention for the parent.
Lots of questions. I'll begin here and go back.
Okay, so here's the scary thing, right? And since you're the theoretical neurologist, I'm curious. When you start to look at the physiological and the DNA implications to match up with these kind of predictive datas, what becomes the overriding piece of information, the data or the physiology?
So I'll say this as a theoretical neuroscientist: there is no complex human behavior which is uniquely defined by anything, genes, development, what have you. It all emerges out of a big complex thing, and for everyone it isn't even the same mix of those complex things. I'm not afraid of leveraging genetic data. In fact, in general, I think a lot of the fear comes out of the idea that these things are genuinely predictive and in a fixed way. So the implications, for example, of strength finders is typically that this is you, period. You're done, these are your strengths, play on them. That just so clearly isn't true. Let me give, I mentioned to some of you a really great research study that was done in Kingston, Jamaica. It started 25 years ago. So University College London helped design an intervention system for them. The Kingston government sent social workers to the home of severely at-risk toddlers in the Kingston area. So these are kids who'd be lucky, the best chance of getting out of the slums of Kingston is to go to jail. 1 hour a week for 2 years, social workers went to their home and worked with these, not the kids, but their parents, on what we might call social-emotional parenting skills. And then it ended. They ran out of money, 2 years, done. 20 years later, a group of economists in UC Berkeley and University of Chicago go down, study these kids. They earn 25% more than their at-risk peers. They're economically indistinguishable from the general population. And in follow-up research, they spend less time incarcerated, and they literally live longer and healthier lives. So there is no sense. I mean, if you believe in education, then you believe people can change. That is a fundamental precept of education. And so I'm only interested in genetics in the sense that I can identify something that I can actually improve about somebody.
Well, what's interesting is, like with epigenetics now, what we're starting to see is that, the whole nature versus nurture question is coming back into the forefront in the sense of we can change the genetic code based on the nurture factor in a child's environment, and then that code can be passed to the next generation for benefit or detriment.
So one of the aspects of that that's most closely related to specific interventions we have in our system is stress reduction in the household. Turns out high-stress households are a causal factor in things like having a decreased working memory span. So to be grotesque about it, it literally makes those kids stupider, which then you think the world's a meritocracy. What about these kids that never had a chance to be the person they could have been? So yeah, these are, biologically it's complex, ethically it's complex, but it is possible to make a change.
So I'm curious, what do you think is the role, because you mentioned how you're listening to things that are going on in the classroom and then using that data and sending tips to parents. What do you see, if anything, of the role of the teacher? And are you working with teachers at all to use the data?
Yeah, so we do this all the way through some experimental work of actually doing this in the workplace as well. But originally we were focused on teachers. And so, for example, we piloted a system for faculty where essentially it came on like Clippy. It would pop up and it would say, during the act of grading a paper, hey, Maria needs more gentle feedback. And underneath, we always provide the explanation. So if you text us, if the parent texts us why, we text back an explanation. Here it just came wholesale. This is a real finding and a real intervention. Students like Maria that receive harsher critical feedback are 80% more likely to drop out of the degree program, even if they're passing. And it would literally pop up in the moment of providing feedback. The faculty knows the content, they know the grade, they don't know how to frame it. We're going to help them with that.
So, when you mentioned the study showing that, that it had this great outcome for these kids who had social workers visiting their parents. And you've talked about how difficult, setting in this listening system is in, a lot of hard to reach places. Have you considered doing and also this would be a useful kind of comparative trial that, and also it's very hard to do predictions and it has lots of ethical and privacy issues and you're listening in on these kids, that maybe you would get some very good outcomes if you just didn't do any of the analysis, didn't look at the kids, didn't put the microphones in the classrooms, but there's a lot of really useful advice that you can send home one text message at a time to the parents. So you have like 300 useful pieces of text message that might be like, you need to sit down with your child for 5 minutes today and talk about what they'd like to do next weekend. Or, can you ask your child to help choose and make dinner? Like lots and lots of useful things that you could just send out at random.
Absolutely.
One text message and see, like, do you get effectively the same results without any of it, but
So
you're not doing interesting technology?
We have a baseline of comparison for projects like Text for Baby, which does this with very, prenatal and postnatal mothers, typically, again, from at-risk populations. There's a lot of work going on at Stanford, just, again, taking text generically, sending them to parents. So we have a point of comparison. And of course, implicitly, our system is basically itself a giant experiment that's looking, it explicitly actually behind the scenes is comparing, well, we could deploy all these different interventions, which one do we actually expect to have the biggest impact, and what would that impact be? Let me take this up to the level of that faculty grading tool. While 11% of students were like Maria and had this catastrophic outcome if they got critical feedback, we found a similar size population, 11%, 9%, actually did slightly better when they got a kick in the ass on a regular basis. So if I'm a faculty and you're a completely asocial person like me, I don't know anyone in my classes, so how would I possibly know what feedback this person should get? So while I think there's a lot of baseline good for those systems that's been shown, the core of it is that there is a very genuine uptick in the performance we can get and also in the relevance of it. So one of the challenges is to say, I told this to a guy named Mitch Kapoor, and he said, oh, why don't you just text them, read to your kids every night? But that's kind of like texting, I have this great app for parents to cook for their families, and every night it texts you and it says, cook for your family. That's nice, but one of the things we find is by providing personalized, and not just personalized for the child, but for the parent recommendations is, hey, Dad, Maria's really interested in seahorses right now. Take 15 minutes and talk to her about seahorses. We didn't say read because we knew he wouldn't be able to find a book about seahorses. We were able to say seahorses because that was her endogenous interest. She'd been chatting away about it in the classroom all week long. So we were able to make it something that literally in the moment of having read it, he could turn to her and do it. So there's real value, proven value in basic generic text messaging systems for parenting and for education. But we found that we can significantly improve on that. Yeah, so we're running the trials to do those comparisons.
We have a final question just over here.
Hey, you mentioned a few countries that you're planning to deploy the product in, and I wonder what are your thoughts about how differently this is going to be received in all those different
So
countries
that's an
that you
interesting thing.
named.
We actually found that we call it framing, but the nature in which each of the intervention recommendations gets framed is actually really crucial. So interestingly enough, I'm going to be really generic about it, but if I sent an intervention to someone like me and I just said, do this thing, then someone like me will just do it. When we sent it to the parents of those migrant kids, I'll be blunt, it came across as, why is this rich white woman telling me that I'm a bad parent? So instead, we'd frame it more like, hey, it turns out if you do this thing, you see these neat results. Just might want to know. And we got roughly 2/3 of the parents, without any incentive to use the system at all, would regularly engage with it. And it dropped dramatically if we were very directive with them. So we have found that culturally we have to make significant changes. Some of that we build directly into it, and we just sort of tag up our interventions as being appropriate culturally for certain populations, but also the reinforcement learning model also learns that certain types of things are more effective, certain framings are more effective with certain families.
2 final burning questions.
Very glad you stayed alive past 25. This is so interesting and fascinating. Have you tested the listening systems on adults? And can those prompts be self-directed? Can I get a text message? I could use it, but also just thinking in terms of, not only is this going to affect HR departments the world over, but potentially, and if it does work with adults, does this hollow out an entire core of middle management across businesses?
So there are 2 points there, and I'll start with the first one because it relates to what we said. I'm interested in augmentive tools. I don't build AI, I build glasses to help people see better. So my vision, which we are working on and in discussions, and I'm going to do work on it while I'm here in New York, is you've got your one-on-one with your direct report this week. Here's the one thing you should focus on. Or you've got a team meeting, here's the one thing you should focus on. Not the content, that's your job, but how to frame it and the cues. A lot of this work is in bias and discrimination, but it applies generically. Also, we've worked with adults in educational contexts as well. So this is big issues for us. When I think of education, I think of it as sort of -1 through 150. Yeah, totally self-directed. We are actually doing a pilot project with a high school in LA. Not that these are total adults, but they're acting as their own parents. And sort of, even though that tool called Muse is specifically meant for parents and young children, they're just sort of piloting it for their own experience because they wanted to. And we're collecting that as feedback to redirect it towards a self-directed system.
I'll keep this short. How much of what you're doing do you think ends up modeling the maze and not the marble? Like, in other words, like you're able to predict the system and not the student.
So maybe a really immediate response is, if it makes a difference, I don't care as much what exactly it's coming out as. So in other words, if I can improve the health outcomes for a kid, and let's be explicit, a lot of this, like particularly general cognitive ability in young children, that is things like stress in the household. The interventions are for the parent, not for the kid, for the most part. So really it's a system that isn't just the child, and I hope I'm getting at some of the question that you're asking, that we're both measuring and trying to make a change in. But again, in the end result, I'm trying to be very practical about it, which is if we really focus on proximal, easily measurable details, want to ruin a great thing, build a test for it. And so those sorts of things tend to go off the rails. People exploit those systems in the same terms that we've talked about with all these moderation tools. So how do we instead, think about the abstract? And if in the abstract, making this change for this kid leads to an improved outcome, even it's not literally about changing the kid, but sort of about clearing the path ahead of them to be the person that they really are meant to be anyways, then I don't care. I just want to live in the world where that kid is happy, healthy, and productive, and I and all of us get to reap the benefits.
On that fantastic note, please thank Vivienne.